One thing I noticed when I started taking this thing apart, as I discussed in the earlier video, the actual pieces, individual pieces of this engine appear to be fairly well made. So I'm getting ready to go ahead and inspect, actually do some measurements, take a real close look at things. That way I can kind of know, you know, are you really actually getting something that has at least a potential to last? Along that lines, I absolutely do not think it has any potential to last at all unless you tear it down and go back through it, because of how poorly it was bolted together. Things were definitely under tightened in critical areas, over tightened in critical areas. So, but we're going to go ahead and check all the individual components, bolt this thing back together the way it's supposed to be, and we'll see how it does. Crankshaft, whenever I looked at the crankshaft, it definitely appears to be a fairly well manufactured crankshaft. I'm looking at the casting, and it's really it appears to be a pretty tight cast iron. In real cheap crankshafts, you can actually see the porousness in the casting even after it's been ground. And that is definitely not the case here. It definitely grinds up real nicely. Even the gears, looking at the grinding on the gears, I've seen worse gears in Japanese motorcycle transmissions for sure. So first impression, looks really good. Some of the measurements I went ahead and took measurements here on both the output side and the flywheel side. Both of them had about 1/1000th taper, the smallest being here, getting a little bit tighter as it gets toward the bearing surface, which is actually not that uncommon. It has about 1/1000th clearance. The bearings, a 25mm bearing on the inside diameter, and this is 1/1000th smaller than that 25. So this will give a slip fit going in and out of the cases. Shouldn't have to press it. Both sides measured identical. And then we went ahead and took a measure of the connecting rod journal, and then that way I can compare it to the rod after a while and see what kind of clearances we're dealing with there. So now we're getting ready to go take it over and make sure that this thing is actually ground straight from this end to this end. So we're heading over that way. All right, now we're getting ready to check to see the indication of this crankshaft, to see if it was actually ground accurately from side to side. Get it on my test stand here. All right. Get this thing indicated into zeros. Now let's see how accurately they machine this thing. The flywheel side is under 1/2,000th out of runout, as well as the output side. This crank is very straight. Now let's go over this head. Just in general, one thing I noticed, I just cleaned this off, the soot off with some brake cleaner, and towel came off real easy. And there is a cut ring that goes all the way around the top of this head, or the bottom of this head. And what that does is it seals against that flat head gasket. And those little sharp edges actually allows for a little bit better sealing, because that way you have a tension here, a gap, and then another tension. And it typically does a pretty good job of sealing that way. Another thing that I looked at, your springs are real weak right here. You probably will not need a spring compressor to install. The valve keepers will probably be able to be installed by hand. I've already got a bunch of stuff here to make my life easier. But this is just a little piece of plastic with a hole in it that's a little bit bigger than the valve. I'm going to take the exhaust valve out first. That just pops out those keepers. Got those two keepers out, and then I want to make sure that I put those both on the exhaust side. This particular engine, you do have a seating washer that goes down against the head. You have the spring, which it looks like a equally coiled spring. Okay, what you have here, you have a spring set. You have the seating washer, which goes against the aluminum. That keeps the spring from beating the aluminum up as your engine's running. It is a very light spring. And I'm trying to look real closely, because some springs will actually have tighter coils and then wider coils in a different location on one end or the other. This one here is definitely not that way, so it can be installed either direction on the spring. Keepers have a good ridge in them, but those little keepers have a little ridge inside of them to make them lock. This actually looks, everything looks as good as it does on pretty much any engine I've taken apart. I'm going to go ahead and push that exhaust valve out. Okay, let's go ahead and pop that intake. Same thing with the intake. I'll show you a picture of the components right there. There you go. They go in that order. When you take it apart, you'll see that this hardened washer, or that steel washer, seats right down there. I'm going to go ahead and push out the intake valve. And if you notice also, the intake valve has an oil seal. The exhaust valve does not. I was just making sure that the seal had some elasticity to it. It does have some pliability. So, all right, there we go. Okay, I'm getting ready to go ahead and clean this up. I'm going to inspect the valve seats real close and see how their tapered and grind is, and also clean the valves up and look at them real closely. Okay, now we're going to do a little quick surgery. I cleaned these seats off real quick, so I'll get a jeweler's loupe and use those along with a pair of calipers. And we're looking at 43 thousandths. I'm measuring the your seat face right there where the valve makes contact. So it's 43 thousandths on the exhaust side. And same on the intake, 43 thousandths. That's actually pretty good. Yeah, there shouldn't be any issues with that. I went ahead and pulled out the valve guides. I'm going to go ahead and install new guides. New seals. I did measure. I went ahead and took my little hole gauge, checked both valve guides, checked them. Both valve guides are at 0.217, 217 thousandths. And I measured that compared to the valves, which are 5.5 millimeter valves. And so you've got 3 thousandths clearance inside your valve guides, which is, it's a little loose if it was a high RPM motor, but this thing's not going to be turning over, 3,000 RPMs or so. I mean, you can go up to, 5, 6 thousandths on these, slower running engines with no concern. So I'm feeling pretty good about that. And they, both bores were very straight, no taper in them at all. And also very smooth. I didn't feel any catching or anything like that whenever I was using my hole gauge. So now that I've got that done, I went ahead and checked to see how round these valves are. What this thing does is you can slip your valve inside this. The valve stem rolls on rollers, and the indicator goes on the valve face. Then I can spin the valve and make sure that valve is not warped, bent, and that it was machined square to that the face was machined square to the stem. That one had 0 run out, which is perfect. That was the exhaust valve, had 0 run out. It was absolutely perfect. Let me check this intake real quick. Like I said, so far, everything about this little machine, this little engine, is making me believe that it may be a really good set of components for what you're paying for. I've definitely had worse built engines for sure. Okay, now we just installed that intake valve. Gonna spin it around. Absolutely 0. That thing is beautiful. I'll try to get you a real nice close-up of the device here. Valve just stays in there, and then the indicator rides on the face. I did want to go ahead and show you a couple other methods. You can use a piece of glass. Be careful, don't cut yourself. But this happens to be a ground plate. It's a hardened steel ground plate that I use, so I know it's really flat. And again, you can take your feeler gauge, try to work it up underneath it, do that all the way around. And this is 1,000th gauge. Not an issue at all. So head's nice and flat. We're ready to put this thing back together.